funded by 50 countries, including Indonesia. And so we work across 50 countries. So what I'm going to try and do today is really tackle two questions in our quick 10-minute presentation slot. Some ideas and examples on how people could be brought into policy making, particularly in arts funding. And the second thing is also to look at how cultural approaches or creativity itself could inform policy making. So to get started, I'm going to talk about how to get people into policy making, which is the main topic of this session. Just to give ourselves a broad overview about this whole participatory governance or participatory planning, which I think we hear more and more about now in the last few years. These could be, of course, top-down, government-led, or they could be civil society up, and I think we're going to hear from our colleagues, Indonesian colleagues, about some civil society-led approaches. Some of them are, unfortunately, one-off and not systemic. Very few countries, I think, have systemic approaches where people are consulted all the time, and fewer countries have permanent structures so that governments can always turn to civil society to look for inputs. Again, they're happening not only at national and local levels, but also at the international level. And I myself was lucky enough to join one of the international policy initiatives which Indonesia conducted along with our colleagues here from UNESCO a couple of years ago, where artists and cultural professionals were invited to give inputs to the 2005 Convention of UNESCO, which really looks at contemporary creativity. So film, visual arts, performing arts, etc. So now consultations of bringing people in also has gone beyond the national level to international instruments. The other thing to keep in mind is to see at where are we in the life of a particular policy? Are we at the design stage? Are we at a monitoring stage? The consultation that we did for the UNESCO Convention on Contemporary Creativity was really at the policy monitoring. So something is already in place and people were invited to comment on how things are going and what could be changed. And the most important thing is, I think there are various types of engagement. Some of them are very simplistic. There is already a policy in place and people can go online and give some feedback. So that is a form of participation from the people, but it is in a way a very early or a limited form. And in other cases, we see that there is really full participation and civil society is actually participating in implementing policy. So there is a whole spectrum. And of course, we know the advantages of doing participatory policy making. I think there is no need to explain that per se. But there are also downsides. There could be clashes between different stakeholder groups, for instance. It's also extremely time-consuming. A lot of research and planning has to go in beforehand. And earlier I was talking about the various levels of engagement. And this really gives us a sense of at some stages, people are, we are still at the transaction or information stages where we are simply asking our civil society to, policies are explained to them. The level of engagement from their side is limited. In other times, they are consulted. And then we move on to consensus building. So they get more and more complex as we go along. And then there is co-delivery and co-creation of policy. So I think the different examples we may have will be across the spectrum. And in many countries and contexts, everything works parallelly. Different policies are at different stages. So what I want to share with you are three sort of interesting examples that I encountered in my work at the Asia-Europe Foundation. They're primarily linked to arts funding. So how are the arts funded in various contexts? And how did those ideas somehow come from the grassroots level? So the first example I want to share with you is something called the Our Singapore Fund. This is, as many of you already know, Singapore has quite a well-funded arts ecosystem. They have an arts council, they have the Ministry of Culture, which really provides grants to individual artists as well as arts groups, including rental subsidies for 3 years. If you're at the start of your, as a new artistic organization, they give you a building and they say you pay very little rent. So it's a very, very systemic and strong support. So a couple of years ago in 2015, Singapore celebrated its 50th anniversary of independence. There was a lot of funding for arts projects, primarily for big, spectacular, presentations about Singapore and what it has achieved. And when they did feedback with the public of Singapore, so in direct response to that, which was a very overwhelming feedback from the public, the Our Singapore Fund was set up. So it's essentially a fund by the government of Singapore, the Ministry of Culture. It complements the other funds they have for professional artists, but this is really just a fund that any Singaporean citizen or permanent resident can apply, and they can do arts projects with it. And one interesting example that came up last year is this Culture Plus, a message from outside. So what they had done was, it was targeted primarily at, to have, like we have pen pals where we write letters to each other. This was paint pals. So inmates in Changi prison, who are long-term inmates in the prison, and senior citizens were linked up. So they were a pair. So there were about 10 pairs who sent pictures to each other instead of letters, and then met and created work together, and then it was exhibited. And this was an initiative that really came, you know, it was not an artist who proposed it, but just somebody from the public, and it worked. Exactly. And it was fully funded by the government. So this idea of the RSG fund itself was an idea that came from the public, and then the government implemented it as a policy measure. So I thought this is something quite interesting and different in terms of arts funding. The other thing that I wanted to present to you is something quite related. So in many countries across, I think, Europe, in the Americas, and here I'm particularly taking the example of Canada and Argentina, they have arts councils where the government gives the arts council money, and then the arts council does open calls and disburses that money to artists and, you know, individuals and art groups. And the selection for this, in order to keep it transparent, is usually done by experts, eminent artists, subject experts. So in the last few years, both the arts councils in Argentina and Canada have been doing surveys to see how many people in the public are enjoying the arts. And so they were sending out questionnaires in which they had a couple of trick questions. So in the first question, they would ask, how many times a week do you consume the arts, or do you participate in an arts event? And they said that many of the public answered no. Then later in the questionnaire, they had another question. How many times do you see a film in a month? And they put 3 times. So they answered that they don't enjoy arts events, they don't go, but they see 3 films a week. Then in the question about television, they said, yeah, I watch 2 hours of TV every day, 1 hour of radio. I go to the theater maybe once in 6 months. So basically, they were enjoying the arts. They just did not know that these things are known as the arts. So this, when they did this survey, and they had similar results both in Argentina as well as in Canada, and now these 2 arts councils are thinking about a completely different way of giving grants. They want to have citizen juries for arts projects. So artists will apply, arts groups will apply, but on the selection committee, there would not only be experts, artists, but they're also considering that a certain percentage of the arts projects will be chosen by citizen juries, just public. Because the way the public sees the arts is really different from how perhaps artists see the arts, and there is sometimes this trap of elitism. So again, this has been something that came from the ground that has now been turned into a policy measure. The third example I want to share with you is one of my pet projects at the foundation, which unfortunately had to be killed off. It's about information. So in Europe, there is a very interesting project called the European Compendium. So every country, the government as well as the cultural sector, they work together, and they have ready at any given point of time the entire map of the arts and culture and heritage of their country, the history, the grants available, the problems, challenges, percentage of GDP that comes from creative work. All the information is ready. This kind of information is still very much missing on the Asian side, I have to say. So about 10 years ago, we started a project with a few other partners to document similarly in Asia. Unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, the project kind of died off. But the problem remains, because this kind of a jointly written national story of the arts, it exists for every single European country, and it then becomes a basis for any kind of policy discussion, negotiation, or reform, because this is a story written by an expert, but it has been blessed, or it's in consensus with the government. So the process of writing sometimes is very slow, because both sides have to agree, and one side cannot dictate. So when you are coming to the consensus, so that's why we come to this whole idea of consensus building between the 2 sides, and then when you have a document like this, which tells you the entire story of your country in the arts, it really becomes the basis for any policy discussions because both sides agree on those numbers. Nobody's going to say, no, but I don't agree with this, what you have written here, because they wrote it together. And I hope that at some point this can be also done on the Asian side. I mean, such reports do exist for about 7 or 8 Asian countries, and those governments still use it. But for the other countries, sometimes it is quite difficult to get information. So sometimes something as simple as information that has been co-written by both sides, government and civil society, becomes the basis for a policy conversation. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, yes, we are talking about how to bring people into the planning process. But in the concept note for this conference, there was also, I think, several times mentioned how we could mainstream culture and cultural approaches into policy making. Now, this is another angle. And the question that I want to ask is, how can we bring arts itself into policy making? And it can be policy making not only for our sector, but policy making in any sector. There's an interesting example that's going from the United Kingdom that I wanted to share. Because we often think of policy making as this very objective and technocratic process, that someone somewhere is sitting with scientific evidence and is making policy. But there is a lot of the emotional and experiential also in policy making. And this is where I think arts, the artist, any creative practitioner jumps in, because most of art is an emotional appeal and a story. And this does have a value for policy making, because policy making is not as like someone sitting in front of a computer with lots of books writing out something. So in that sense, the UK government has a policy lab which is looking at approaches from design, from all the creative fields, in order to test how policy can be made. And this is the example I'm sharing is their example, what they have tried out, because they see the artists as sort of experts in looking at our emotional or the experiential side of things. Because when people have a sort of a deep and emotional experience, which usually happens when you encounter works of art, that gives you a response that can feed into policy. So this is the whole idea of using artwork itself as a way to get responses from the public who otherwise may not engage with a particular issue, or it's too abstract for them or too complex for them. So this idea that physical and emotional experience of looking at art could somehow help to get examples. So this is the famous artist Olafur Eliasson, who basically creates a lot of artworks around environmental themes. And when the UN climate change talks were going on in 2015, he placed on the streets of Paris this artwork, which is essentially something that looks like huge pieces of glacier. They were just melting away. And people watching the thing melting began to respond to it in different ways. So it kind of, in a very physical, visceral way, provoked a conversation around these issues. So to go back to the example from the UK, so the UK government's policy lab, one area in which they've been using art is the whole idea of engagement with data and evidence. So if you want, they used it in the case of a health example that I'm going to share with you. Data is everywhere. Governments use it all the time for policy inputs. But when they send huge reports to the public, nobody wants to read it and then answer a survey and give inputs to the public. They basically either don't answer or just sort of the apathy. There is not that engagement. So this 20-year gap was a project undertaken by two artists and designers, where they took data about what they call the 20-year gap. So in a particular part of the UK, people with good health, lived up to 80 years. But people who had disabilities of a certain kind, as they grew older, their life expectancy fell by 20 years down. So what they did was they mapped about 50 cities, and they had different data for different cities, and they were trying to say that, look, because of certain reasons, these 6 cities are not doing well. But nobody was engaging with the data. So they took the data and they built an artwork. All the blue bottles were hung up to show you would live 60 years, 70 years, 80 years. All the amber color bottles were showing how long you would live with disability. And basically the data was visualized as an artwork. And people came in, they looked at it, and they understood the data, which the reports were also available to them. But nobody responded when the reports were sent out and people were asked to reply. They saw the artwork, and after seeing the artwork, they were asked the same questions that were in the survey, and essentially people replied. They gave ideas of what could be done to solve these policy problems. So they used what is essentially converting data into an artwork and then getting the public to respond on a hard issue like health and disability. So again, this I found quite interesting as a UK government policy lab, trying to use basically the arts as a way to engage people on policy. So I will end on that note. I saw the Time's Up sign as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Anuprema. Can we have a very warm round of applause, please? So I think it's very interesting and important that Ms. Anuprema is underlining is that people do not really see that they are enjoying arts when they are in fact doing so. So for instance, when they are watching movies, when they're going even to the shopping malls and then enjoying some of the very famous paintings in the mall, they don't see it as an activity of arts. And we know that Singapore was the location of this very famous movie last year. Who remember that movie? Crazy Rich Asians. Remember, the Lo Passat never got even more famous ever since being featured in that movie. And the chimes, and we saw this in the Indonesian Hollywood production movie of, come on, you know this movie. Julia Roberts played in this movie. Eat, Pray, and Love. Exactly, Ibu Bini. See, she's a fan of Julia Roberts, or maybe the Balinese. Anyway, that's another story altogether. But that's what we want to see, my fellow Indonesians. Singapore, maybe relatively smaller than Indonesian in terms of size, could put many of its very famous art scenes in that movie, and boom, Hollywood adopt that. That's what we want. It takes more than just Eat, Pray, Love. We need other scenes to be promoted. Ibu Bini, the floor is yours. If I may say something about Ibu Bini is the current expert senior advisor to the Deputy Chief of Staff, responsible for political communication and information dissemination in the Executive Office of the President of Indonesia.
Thank you so much, Pak Yohanes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Selamat sore. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera buat kita. So, I would like to start with a disclaimer that I've never been an expert on culture and art. I do enjoy art, I think. No, I'm sure I'm enjoying art. I don't go to movies like 3 times a week because I cannot afford the times, but I do watch Netflix.
There you go.
And television, because I'm from the older generation, then I watch television. The younger generation, they stop watching television because all in their hands and, the world and everything. Second of all, I would probably bore you a bit because I'm going to talk more on Indonesians' experience in participatory method in policy making, and just a little bit on the thoughts about what I think art and culture could do, which as a country, we haven't really been able to transform it and explore, and using the cultural approach as our methodology because of the complexity. So, this is, wait a minute, where's the clicker? Here it is. Yeah.
Boleh dibantu?
Yeah, somehow, okay. Oh, wait. Yeah. This is just to repeat actually about how people think that participatory, but we all think, every government and every non-state actors and the pro-democracy movement, we all agree that yes, participatory method is important, that it has become increasingly important, and that we all are applying that, but we also acknowledge the deficit of the method. And I'm going to just share with you the Indonesian experience in participatory method. What I'm going to say that we have used the partisanship method way before the democratic era, that transition era that Indonesia has enjoyed since 1998. In the 1990s, I have my friend here. We all grew in those era, right? Ibu Dolorosa. We already, especially the champion and the advocates are the non-state actor, are the civil society organization. They introduced the participatory method at the community level, at the village level, and they call it PRA, and then there's a participatory mapping, and then the government, we all have the Musrembang or the national planning budget used with dialogue and consensus building through the village level. But I would like to emphasize here that we could only enjoy the participatory method and the public participation because of the strategic environment that we have. So the transition from the authoritarian rule to the democratic government contributes, it's very meaningful, it's a very significant actor. Along with that, we have a more opening political space, and along with the increase or the existence of a democratic era in Indonesia, then came not automatically, but more public awareness of how important the public policy is for everyone. That it really is important that people could take control and take part and make the decision makers accountable to them. And then we reach the stage where there is more political opening space, and there are government that are willing to have a dialogue. So the methodology that has been used or that was used is then again combinations of participations at the grassroots along with more technocratic, and then it has also increased the scales of the non-state actors to use some methodologies, survey, etc., etc. And then I just would like to inform the participants that we should actually celebrate what we have achieved. We often forgot what we have achieved and our journey. For example, we have been able to amend the Constitution. Yes, now we are currently also hearing that people want to amend it again. Then it creates another debate, but I'm not going to go into that. I just would like to say that we, the people of Indonesia, were able to amend the constitutions 4 times so that actually we have a more democratic government structures. And then we have a new election law, which was passed in 2004, which we have never imagined before, that we could have direct elections for the presidential level up to the subnational level. We have never imagined that it could happen. It happened. And we have a law on domestic violence, which I could never imagine it could happen, because Indonesia is a pretty patriarchal country. Yeah, we could never imagine that domestic violence would be something that will be able to be put on the public sphere and become a law. Now we are advancing. Of course, there's deficit, but the fact is there. And we have all the election committee and the ombudsman, the National Commission on Human Rights. And also the other strategy from 1998 onward is the development of more collaboration between the non-state actors. For example, the government and the civil society managed to establish this national strategy on poverty eradication in 2004. Okay, what happened? Oh, diarahin. Oh. Yeah, and then there's also a new focus in the among the civil society and the public about interest in the public policy. So now we see that people are very conversant about budget, which was not the case 15 years ago. People have increased the knowledge and the skills about legal drafting, and also people talk more. So it becomes more, they've become more expert and more detailed, and also enter into the technocratic ways of participation. I just would like to allude that along that the acknowledgements of the importance of popular policy making, we have also, Indonesia also has been able to develop a more, a better, a friendlier enabling environment with some law in place. For example, law number 14, 2008 on the public information disclosure, government regulation number 45 on 2017 on public participations on local government program, etc. And more, not really government, but co-planning and co-implementation of program between the NGOs and the government has been used. For example, Indonesia also part of the open government. The government of Indonesia also has a program of human rights cities where it involves lots of community and NGOs. And then we recently have the established the National Committee of SDGs Implementation. It was under the presidential regulation in 2017, where the non-state actors are a member of the National Committee. However, criticisms on the approach remain the same. The process of consultations of engagement is felt by many is not inclusive, and it often lacks the ability to reflect the perspective of the minority, women, and disabled group, and too bureaucratic approach, and too technical. Whereas then we come to the questions whether one of the possible solution is just the cultural approach. And I'm just taking this from buku Strategi Kebudayaan, which was recently published, I think last year. What are the features according to buku Strategi, the cultural strategy of Indonesia? It's consensus building, recognizing local wisdom, honoring diversity, providing rooms for participations of the minority groups, women, disabled, and nurturing the nurturing the environment. Now, what I would like to say, it's not that neither of the government and the non-state sector have not been using that. Yes, they have. Of course, with PRA and partnership mapping, the role of local leader and the use of local wisdom has been there, but somehow it hasn't been able to color or to be mainstream on the policy that was developed. So something must be a problem here. This is just an illustration that this practice of conservations in one of the islands has been there since the 15th century. Everybody in the environmental sector knows about it, and we talk about it, but there is a gap between this celebrating local wisdom and the policy making. I certainly see that there's a lot of opportunity of cultural approach, but the question is whether it could be transformed into technocratic policy which we all need in terms of policy making. So I'm going to end this with the, oops. Okay, what happened? Okay, I'm going to end these presentations with the end notes. Yeah, that cultural approach could fill the gap, but we do have to overcome the challenge. And I honestly see that IFAC actually could play that role, to be the mediator and to provide a new platform. Thank you very much.
There are many important features just presented by Ibu Bini. I think that's why she's the expert staff to the president, yes? So that the president listens to Ibu Bini's insights on cultural approach. No, seriously, Ibu, lots of things to be discussed later on. And I do invite the participants to raise your question through Slido. If you could see on the left and right side on the whiteboards, you'll see that you could raise your question digitally after all. We are now in the digital era. In fact, in the Foreign Ministry, we already accustomed with the digital diplomacy. So yes, you could raise your question in Slido. You just put on the number, is it 4283, hashtag 4283, and then raise your question and we'll answer it after the third speaker. And now we're going to give the floor to Ibu Valencia Huta Barat, who is the Managing Director of Kekini Co-working Space. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I would like to thank you, the committee, for having me here, and it's an honor for me to share this stage with these two strong women. I've always been a fan of both of you. So maybe I just introduce a little bit about myself. I've been crisscrossing, to different disciplines in the past 10 years. My background is mostly in the cultural sector for the policy making, but since 2010, I'm focusing more and more into creative economy and creative cities, but still within the cultural sector perspective. So what I'm going to share for today is actually how the non-state actor, as Ibu Bini puts it, actually taking an active part in encouraging or enforcing the government to create a policy that would benefit not just the cultural sector, but the society in general. When I first got the tour, it's called the Bringing People Back, and then it's like quite a long title. My first thought was like, where do the people go? We're here, we're not going anywhere. But probably it's been a while since, even though Bubini said that there's already been a lot of efforts to do a participatory approach, but in reality, they're still lacking of participation from people in policy making. And I don't remember all my slides, so. There are two cases that I'm going to present today. So maybe I think the battery is not right. So the first case is ICCN. ICCN is an Indonesian Creative Cities Network. It's how do you call it? Civil society initiated network. It was started in 2010 when like a few like-minded people come together out of the concern of the rising intolerance, the problem of freedom of expressions, which we feel like a very strong threat to the arts and culture sector, including my friend Gustav here. He was one of the very few people who actually started the discussion on this. So the discussion went on, but because people are very busy, especially the civil activists. So we sort of like on and off with the discussion, and then only in 2014 we managed to come together again to say, okay, where are we going with this? So that's including actually in the first conversation we had, we have Bapak Yanuar Nugroho, who's now in the presidential staff as well. And then we thought like, okay, how can we, if we bring arts and culture, it's very difficult language to approach the government in any level, either cities or in the national level. So we thought, okay, now there is this notion about creative cities, about creative economy. Is there a way that we could approach, these two rising sectors, but using it from arts and culture perspective? So we thought, okay, let's in 2014, when I was still working with the British Council, one of the things that I designed is the program to actually connect 5 cities. What we would like to do is actually to find toolkit for cities to be able to map their own assets, but it comes from the non-state actors, so from the community themselves, from the citizens themselves. Why? Because it's very important. A lot of times when we have references, it comes from abroad, mostly Europe. In our case, with the creative economy, creative cities is very much, how do you call it, berkiblat. So like, yeah, it's like our Mecca is Britain, because they're the first one who brought the notion of creative economy and creative cities here. So yeah, so then we thought, okay, maybe there is a way to actually adopt and modify and create our own tools, because like, Indonesia is a very large and very diverse country. So then we need to find sort of like a general tools that could help the communities to map their own needs and their own assets, but they can also modify and adapt it according to their context. So that's where the ICCN, the first workshop comes, and then after that we have like around 5 cities. At that time we said, okay, let's try to create like a network based on this. And we brought the idea to other networks, including at that time there is a BCCF, Bandung Creative City Forum, who actually was holding the design, what was that, Gustav? Design City, yeah? Design City project. So we try to approach, because Gustav at that time was quite close, you were advising for the city government of Solo. So we thought, would you like to actually become the, the pioneer for this, who wants to start at the, the work between community and government? And maybe, and then the next step is actually, would it be possible for us to collaborate between the city of Surakarta and the city of Bandung? So that's how we started, and then they agreed, and then, one thing led to another. In 2015, we declare the Indonesian Creative Cities Network. So what is the basis of the Creative City Network? Is this 10 principles, which is brilliantly drafted by Gustav. So you can, I'm not going to read all of that, but these are the ways that we thought, if we want to talk about creative cities, creative economy, these are the issues that we find is important to have, to implement. If you have all these things, then you can call yourself creative city. Actually, this is our way to enter this very difficult discussion when we are talking to the government, if you want to talk about these things. I mean, like, you cannot just talk about human rights with the local city government, or, for example, like a compassionate. What is compassionate? What is being inclusive? It's, at that time, it's not a very popular, those are not very popular words. So creative city become our entry point. Yeah, so 2015 is ICCN was established. It was, before it was just the Quadrohelix, it was the community, government, business and academia, but since I think 2017, yeah, we add the media, so it becomes a pentahelix. So we also refer to this SDG 11, to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. And we took some of the UNESCO Creative Cities definition when we envisioned ICCN. So the work is quite complex. Why? Because every city and because we have city, we have kabupaten, that is loosely translated as regencies, I would say, which has very different character to each other. And then also, like, if you are a city in Java, you have a very different character with a city in Sulawesi or in eastern part of Indonesia or in Sumatra. So how to actually build a network that connects these really diverse, communities, city governments, business people, and academia. So the idea was actually in the beginning we talk a lot about okay, we need to do advocacy, but how to do the advocacy, because none of us are actually lawyers. Only like very few of us are lawyers who understand how like formal or structural legal formal how do you call it, mechanism work. So we thought, okay, maybe let's encourage every city to have a creative community. The creative community they can form themselves, but then the requirement to become a member of the ICCN is actually when you form yourself as a creative community, you have to have all these connections with the other four sectors, which is the A, B, C, G, and M, the ABGM. We do research and development, and every year we try to do conferences and festival in the past 2 years, and then in city skills development. So because we realized that we are actually a pool of resources. So then a lot of times, some of us are actually traveling around to share some skills, and the last one is network development. We also try to create the network not only within the community themselves, but also within the five sectors, the four other sectors. So for example, with the government, we have MOU with the Ministry of Coordinating Ministry of Economy. We've spoken to the Ministry of Villages. We've spoken to the Ministry of PUPR. What's PUPR? Public Works, and also, of course, the Creative Economy Agency. As you can see, this is just only a few. The last count was around 150 cities. So it spreads all the way from Medan to the farthest east is in Ternate. I would just, this is a very good example. Last September, actually, we had our fourth conference in Ternate. Ternate is very interesting because Ternate still has a kingdom. So when they held this conference, they have to navigate with the local government and the kingdom, because a lot of the cultural activities that they were doing is actually related to the living culture that is sort of like not regulated, but like under the eyes of the kingdom. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but maybe just a few. So this is the hugging Gamalama mountain. So Ternate, if you've been to the North Moluccans, basically they're like, a stretch of mountains. Every island consists of one mountain. So the idea is, this is something that they already have within their their cultural archive, and they invite 42,000, basically almost everyone in Ternate, to circle around Gamalama mountain. So this is, and they have to get permission from the kingdom. So this is the flag. You see two flags. It's one Indonesian flag, and the other one is the kingdom flag. So they circle from the kingdom, and then the flag goes around. It's very exciting because it's the first time actually for a lot of people in Ternate to feel that they are part of something there. And it's also we found that this kind of events is important for the communities in that particular area, because it gives them a sense of identity. They can host something that But the things that I've told you, it's not that it doesn't come with challenges. Actually, the big challenge is also coming from our own organizations and our own communities. When you talk about creative city, you talk about creative economy. When you talk about creative economy, unfortunately, the big discussion is still about production and market. But you don't talk about what is actually the fuel of creative economy. What is the fuel of creative city? What is the fuel of creativity itself? So my take, personally, I always said, like, you know, we cannot talk about creative economy without talking about arts and culture. So I always put like arts and culture in the middle of creative economy, in a way that arts and culture is actually the living library where you can get all the innovations, you can get all the materials, you can get all the data to create whatever product that you want. So that is like my personal vendetta, my personal campaign. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge it's independency, because once you become a community that is being recognized by the government, you become the sort of like the go-to person for creative things that the government most of the time don't understand. If you're not careful, it's very easy to become like the underbow of the government work, so then it's easily distract you from being critical to the government. But at the same time also, we sort of like, it's not happening yet, but there are already some communities who said like, they fear that they are going to be used during the election, the local election, because they are the constituent of the local election. So this is like the main challenge for us within ourselves. Time is up. Maybe can I just have like 2 or 3 minutes just to have another case? Because it's also unique, if it's okay. So the second case is Jogja festivals. Jogja, they have like around 400 festivals. 15 of them are nationally and internationally recognized. So in 2014, we sort of like come together and offer whether they would like to create a platform to connect these festivals together and to promote the festivals together, and also to do advocacy policy to the government to support the Arts and Culture Festival. So then in 2016, they finally create the platform. It's called Experience Diversity. And the big vision is to become one of the world festival cities, like Edinburgh or like Georgetown. And this is the 5 festivals, but then let me just give you a just 1 minute video. Since we have the platform, like all these festivals starts working together, so they start collaborating. Before they know of each other, but they don't really talk to each other. So then we have the gamelan, custom shows, the platform allows the festivals to do data collection. It's still very manual, but then we try to be disciplined to have data collection for the festival, including, this is just one of the example. We become, again, pool of resources, so then if anyone from any part of Indonesia wanted to look for a good stage manager, program manager, you know, directors, artists, they can just go and see Jogja Festival. They have a festival forum starting this year to actually support the other festivals in Jogja. And the last one is the advocacy and campaign to the local government, so then to see festival beyond tourism, but also to see the impact of festival for the good of the people who are in Jogja. So again, these are the challenges. Remember that this is all are done by civil actors, and with civil actors, because we need to live as well, it's on voluntary basis. We have too many roles because we do advocacy, we need to work, we need to do other things. Very limited financial resources, everything is done by bancakan. What is bancakan? Like pulling money together. And then as a result, there's a very limited movement. So yeah, so I would stop on that note. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Ibu Valencia. Couldn't agree more with your presentation, particularly when you highlighted that the core of creative economy shouldn't be only about market, because if my memory serves me well, I think the author of The Orange Economy, Ivan Marquez, stated in his very famous book, yeah, it's the core of creative economy is creativity. So of course, it's very much connected to arts and culture. Without creating arts and culture, without having incepted arts and culture as part of our mentality as humans, creative economy wouldn't be created. And we know that Indonesians are very creative. But how come the speakers and the moderator only see 2 questions today? Haven't our millennial youngsters raised their questions? Hello. You are welcome to raise your questions in Slido, as seen on the left and on the right whiteboards. So please raise your questions. At the moment, we have 2 questions, and we begin from the first one. Yes? Our smart ladies. So the first one is from Muhammad Saud from University of Airlangga in Surabaya. If participation is important, then how do you think about student participation in protests in Indonesia? Perhaps it's not about protest, perhaps it's about demo, yeah, demonstration. Besides, you have high number of youth. Where is Muhammad Saud, by the way? Hello, Mas Muhammad Saud. So could we begin with Ibu Bini? Yeah, yes.
Thank you, Pa Saud. Yes, we do have lots of young people, the young generations, and as a government, we acknowledge we are not very creative engaging the youth, and that's why we are having this conference, right? And it's very inspiring to hear how many other ways to engage the youth. I would say that the protest came because, as I said, public policy making, participatory method, has not been able to respond all the answer, has not been able to capture all the aspirations. I mean, we have done the best that we could, but we also acknowledge the deficit in implementations of the participatory method. What we're facing is the rigidity of the bureaucracy in one hand, and then the enthusiasm from the public on the other hand. And we are experimenting, and we are trying our best to come to the middle of this. And this requires a good dialogue. And good dialogue is not always in place for many issues. And in the case, and this is not about culture, I think I'm talking about politics now. In the case of the student movement, I think it's exactly what it is. There's a breakdown of dialogue. There is the absence of narrative that is understood by the youth of and by the students. But the president himself has said, you know, students, you could always protest, you could always demonstrate, because that's what the democratic government does. You could do that. So, yeah, and then we're listening to the aspiration. Thank you.
Terima kasih Ibu Bini. So Pak Muhammad Saud jelas ya. The government is listening and Ibu Bini would make sure, yes, when she listens,
And Pak Yohanes also part
when
of the
she
government.
listens, the president listens. We're from the foreign ministry. Ibu is closer to the president, ya. Aduh. Jadi Ibu Inang Winarso, the second one. Where is Ibu Inang Oh, Bapak, mohon izin. Bapak Inang Winarso comes up with the question, how creative city to become the cities without injustice? The cities with injustice or without injustice? So in fact a just city ya Pak ya, karena without injustice that's double negative. Ibu Valencia.
Okay, I can safely say I don't know how, because I think this is a question for all of us to think about. I think that's why we believe that there needs to be more dialogue about how to connect. Because when we talk about creativity, often we don't connect creativity to what actually happens on the field. So we're also struggling on how to connect like what's happening on the field. If there's like violence, either by civilians or by state apparatus, like how are we going to deal with that? How can we use creativity to actually reduce violence? Like, do we need more festivals? Do we need more artwork, like public artwork, something that is engaging public to discuss and to connect with one another, and most importantly, to understand one another? Because like in this era where people only trust information from their cell phone, the getting to know the other, it's becoming less and less, if not if not absence at all. So then that's why actually again the arts and culture sector, it's still very, very important, because the arts actually, the process of creative thinking in the arts enable us to have and to engage in that conversation without having to face it directly, in your face. I think that's what I could say about that question. Thank you.
If I may sum up what you just stated, basically the arts and culture soften you, but it makes you also meet your target, yes? Or still not soften?
No, I think the arts have the power to actually allows people to reflect and think about what happens around them.
Reflection. Then you get the solution. Not necessarily, but it makes you think. And when you think, you would be silent. You would be trying to find the solutions. Ibu Bini?
Yeah, I think I would like to second that, because if we talk about conflict, if we talk about injustice, then the solution may not necessarily be very formal and very technocratic. I think experiences in many parts of the world, one of the thing that could persuade people is actually through art. To go back to the culture, because the culture is your value, right? And I think in many conflicts, then people come together because they organize a festival, maybe sport festival, but something really close to their heart is their values, how they work outlook, which is often absent in policy making.
Referring to the question about creative cities and justice, there is an interesting example from Europe. As you know, there's the whole conversation about the migrants. Who do we let in? Who do we not let in? And there are a lot of artists in exile from the conflict zones such as Syria, who have been facing problems. You may have heard the case of some of them stuck in airports, stateless. There's been a new initiative that a few pioneering cities in Europe have come together to form a cities of refuge network. So local municipalities that are more open, willing to take in artists in exile, have made a network simply to respond to this question that we speak about creative cities, how much money it generates from creativity. But then when it comes to the question of letting in someone, an artist facing exile, then at that time we decide to close the doors. So the Cities of Refuge network is pretty interesting in that municipalities are sort of giving some guarantees to bring in and to put artists in place, give them some facilities, a temporary safe haven. So there are, I think, this question of justice and cities and juxtaposing the creative and the justice issues, I think it is on the agenda. And there are examples of interesting networks that are addressing both. And I think what was very interesting when you presented was that the number one in your thing was compassion. Everything came sort of after that, and that once again points to the fact that we speak a lot about promoting our cities as creative, let's bring tourists in, let's become sort of famous on the map. But then when it comes to the hard questions like compassion and justice, then we begin to falter. So I think it's good to put those hard issues on the table, because I think only a welcoming city, an inclusive city, can be a creative city. You cannot be creative and then exclude women or disabled or people in various sorts of trouble. So I think that this is becoming an issue, and city governments are sort of responding. If not national governments, at least city governments are responding. We have another question now.
About to make the summary, and apparently there's another question. Okay, so question from Miss or Mr.? Miss In Jung Cho. Are different levels of civil social organizations in international, national, regency and local level working together to build creative cities? If you could have a very short answer from Ibu Valencia, because I think time is running against us.
Yes, this is, there are already several initiatives. I mean, UNESCO have UNESCO Creative Cities. You have the UCLG, United Cities Local Government, also talking about creative cities. You have the Southeast Asia Creative Cities Network. In Indonesia, you have ICCN. So, and then there's this new one that is trying to connect creative cities South-South. Yes, there has been efforts, but again, the challenge is because it's a civil society movement, it's just taking more energy to get there.
Does Sister City is effective enough for this advancement of culture? I think it's a question for every speaker, but do mindful, because we're running against time. Maybe we start from Ms. Anuprema this time.
I mean, I think sister cities, twinning of cities, for me, the way I see it is that sister cities are largely sort of government-to-government initiatives or diplomatic initiatives. They do serve some value, of course, because you begin to know another city well. But I think in today's sort of time, with the complexity of problems that we have, and also because we are so hyper-connected, for me, this network among cities, and this leads to the question that Ms. Cho raised before, I think this is the time for global networking among cities to share not only good practices, but also, I think something which we don't share so much is what we tried and where we failed. Because people try always to sell the positive side. So I think there is value in sister cities, perhaps to deepen government relationships and connections. But for real learning and knowledge exchange, I think the idea of networks among, connecting global south to global north, but also south-south. Sometimes we don't talk enough to our neighbors. We are very well connected to those very far from us, but not to those in the neighborhood. So I think that kind of a network of cities in the neighborhood, there's so much opportunity for exchange and learning. Valencia, would you like to say something?
I would agree with that. Sister cities is effective with the participation of the citizens. Yeah, because otherwise it would just two documents from two city governments.
So there's no other question? Okay, so we're summing up. Yes, participants? Otherwise, moderator would get quite upset because of the organizing committee. in America, in US, they say there's a red dot or a silver lining among what is stated by our distinguished speakers this afternoon. But in Indonesia, we say ada benang emas, because golden thread, our very valued possession in terms of culture. One of our songket, as well as tenun Makassar, as worn by Ibu Bini, is featured by its golden threads. So participants that would like to see golden threads, go approach Ibu Bini after the session. The golden thread, benang emas, from the discussion this afternoon, the first one is culture. We wouldn't be here today if it's not because of culture. Either it's Indonesian culture as well as Singaporean culture. We have all people from all walks of life have their very own culture. In fact, it identifies us. And the second one would be openness. Each one of you, in fact, underlines compassion. Ms. Anuprema, you were the first speaker, and in fact, you also underline compassion also in your presentation, and Ibu as well as Ibu Bini. And we wouldn't have compassion if we don't feel open towards other culture. Indonesia consists of 17,000 and more islands as we are speaking, because some islands are now even located with our new planet system. And if we cannot be open to other people from different background as well as different island region, then we wouldn't be enriched with this various culture. Ibu Dolorosa has given me that stern look. I hope she agrees with me this time. And third, of course, then we would have the bottoms-up approach. I think the three speakers have vividly highlighted that community participation is a must-do in the 21st century state, particularly including in Indonesia. So without further ado, of course, we would love to have our young millennials and our Indonesians to participate more actively. Do send, although I'm a bit disheartened with seeing only 4 questions and maybe only 2 from the millennials. Hopefully in the next session, after we have our coffee, because the speakers also need some coffee, you know, caffeine booster this afternoon, then you would be able to raise more questions. Without further ado, thank you to our distinguished speakers. And we would like to close the session with a very millennial way. Ibu, let's do some wavy. Apparently, we still have some gift session.